Welcome to this Aztlander presentation, Forgotten Journals from a Lost City, Jean-Frédéric Waldeck's Palenque Field Diaries, an early testimony of Maya art, architecture, and writing. And this is part one of the two-part series with Johann Begel and José Daniel Martínez Gastélum. Let's first listen to Johann Begel with an intro to all things Waldeck.
In this presentation, I will attempt to retrace part of the life and work of this rather atypical explorer. For my part, I have devoted nearly 5 years to selecting the most interesting texts and transcribing them, which, as you will see, is not always easy. I'm currently revising the Spanish translation with a view to publishing his complete journey from his departure from Mexico City to his return to Villahermosa. The rest is told by Waldeck himself in his Voyage pittoresque et archéologique dans la province du Yucatan. These volumes will also include letters, extracts from other diaries, and drafts of unpublished books, which we will see below. They amount to 326 pages in French alone. I'm currently in the process of revision, so please excuse any remaining errors in English. What I'm about to show and cite is shocking, racist, colonial, and indeed unpleasant. We do not in any way endorse Waldeck's comments, but we believe that studying his objective data, stripped of inappropriate remarks, remains important for research. I apologize in advance for the humorous tone, but given the character, it's probably for the best. You will understand. In fact, we know very little about the early years of Waldeck's life. The problem is that he used to tell different versions of his life to each person with whom he spoke, especially toward the end of his life and with women. In his perpetual quest for recognition, he often embellished his stories to make himself appear greater. Thus, facts that should be firmly established, such as his birthplace in Prague, Vienna, Paris, or Waldeck in Hesse, his nationality, Austrian or German naturalized French, his supposed nobility, duke, baron, viscount, count, and even his actual date of birth remain controversial. According to his declared age, he would have been 66 years old when he arrived at Palenque. In 1822, he was hired to lithograph drawings by Almendaris for the London publisher Berthoud for the forthcoming work Antiquities of Mexico, commissioned by Edward King, Viscount Kingsborough. This was undoubtedly the beginning of his interest in the history and archaeology of this continent, still little known in Europe. Immediately, he believed that these drawings were necessarily inaccurate, even false, and that he could do much better. He then embarked for Mexico, where he would spend 11 years, as we shall see. Upon his return to Europe, he tried at all costs to have several works published, but in the end only one appeared. He died in 1875, officially at the age of 109. Possible, perhaps. In fact, when the French Ministry of Education purchased some of his drawings to serve as the basis for Brasseur de Bourbourg book, Waldeck had to present a birth certificate. My hypothesis, still unverifiable, is that he provided his father's birth certificate. It would not have been unusual at the time to bear the same name. If we subtract a generation from his age, that is at least 20 years, we arrive at a maximum of 89, which is already respectable and much more logical. Thus, he would have been in Palenque around the age of 40, which is far more credible. This hypothesis would also explain the invention of the useful adventure that we are about to discuss. We have to keep in mind that Waldeck always wanted to be seen as the patriarch of the American archaeology, and moreover, that when they purchased his drawings, they offered him a rent each month, and if he was supposed to be much older, it would have been cheaper for French ministry, but he knew that he would live for many years. Buried in Père Lachaise, I discovered that his plot expired after a century and his remains were transferred to the ossuary of this famous Parisian cemetery. Several researchers have examined his work, but so far they are focused more on biographical or historical artistic aspects. That is why we are more interested in the raw data contained in his writing and drawings, because even today we can extract valuable information from them that no longer exists. This last book is currently in review. But let's start with the fantastic adventures of Super Waldeck in his youth. I'm sorry I can keep a straight face in this part, but you will soon understand why. According to anyone who would listen, Waldeck took part in the revolutionary insurrection in France before visiting Queen Marie-Antoinette, who was imprisoned in the Conciergerie. He maintained friendly relations with Lord Byron, Robespierre, Marat, George III, Fox, Pitt, Sheridan, Beau Brummel, and the Count of Orsay and Humboldt. He then explored Southern Africa with Le Vaillant in 1785. After his return, he studied painting with Jacques-Louis David, Joseph-Marie Vien, and Pierre-Paul Prudhomme. He also claims to have participated in the siege of Toulon in 1794. He also supposedly participated in Napoleon's campaign in Italy in 1795 and in the Egyptian expedition in 1798 with the rank of captain, under a false identity to hide his Austrian nationality, according to him. During the Ottoman siege of Aswan in 1801, he fled with 4 comrades and claims to have been the only survivor of the journey across the Dongola Desert. After passing through Madagascar, he ended up on the island of Mauritius, where he joined the crew of the famous privateer Surcouf in 1807 or shortly thereafter. Always in search of adventure, he also claims to have helped Lord Cochrane during Chile's independence. He then claims to have sailed from there by river, following the Marañón and its tributaries, and then the Copan River to Copan in Honduras. So a river several thousand kilometers long between South and North America, of course. Similarly, he would have crossed the Americas from Spitsbergen to Tierra del Fuego. Dr. Callaway spotted that it is not impossible that some of his exploits were taken from the biography of Claudio Linati. Linati was the real count who, like Waldeck, lithographed Mexican traditions, but who actually studied with Jacques-Louis David in Paris and served as an officer in Napoleon's army. Of course, all these adventures are at best implausible and at worst mere lies. In a very unfriendly article, Klein says, if not entirely false, Waldeck exaggerated many of the stories of his early adventures to mythical proportions, or Waldeck was a great storyteller who used to give his best when surrounded by an admiring female audience. I will skip over his early years in Mexico, but after being hired as an engineer in the mines of Tlapujawa, where his skills clearly did not shine, he had a difficult time in Mexico City. He alternated between putting on a phantasmagoria show, painting theater and opera sets, where he also sang, running an illegal gambling den, and then, when he could, working as a miniaturist, lithographer, draftsman, and painter. But in 1826, the Palenque Prize was published because the Paris Geographical Society wanted to know more about the publication of Del Rio's expedition report. It has often been said that Waldeck was a scholar and a multi-talented man. In reality, he was more a self-taught artist whose work was dictated by the condition under which the prize was awarded. Also, he knew how to paint and measure buildings. He had to face the impossible task of the prize. In fact, those who decreed it were clearly unaware of the reality on the ground when they gave a year to complete this task to anyone who can. As you undoubtedly know, Waldeck was not the first to explore the ruins of Palenque. Also, the Cholmaya never forgot the ruins. They were officially rediscovered in the first half of the 18th century by the priest of Tumbala. They were subsequently visited by various famous figures. Waldeck was not kind to them. I quote, "Del Rio was not a great draftsman either. After him, Dupuy, accompanied by Castaneda as a draftsman, did nothing good. Think Castaneda does not know how to draw." Or, "Mr. Stephens is mistaken in saying that he had everything drawn. He did not even see the astronomical relief that I translated, and many other that he did not even suspect, and his description is very insignificant." And these testimonies are precious because the bas-relief have deteriorated over the years, as you can see, but Dr. Callaway will tell you about this better than I can. Let us now turn to the expedition to Palenque. Waldeck remained there for 13 months, 3.5 of which he spent living directly on the site. His expedition was protected by Bustamante's conservative party, as the president of the society was none other than Lucas Salaman, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. But the numerous revolution and coup d'etat soon called this protection into question. From the outset, Waldeck had problems with the members of his expedition, most of whom were French. They all left, some after trials, because it was clear that they had signed up to make the most of the opportunity. Once Waldeck was left alone, he was finally able to work. Various events then unfold, as we shall see. Let's start by talking a little about his diary. As you can see, it's not easy writing, even though the writing is fluid. Secondly, those who know French will see that his style is catastrophic. For the rest of you, just look at the word underlined in red. There are almost no punctuation marks, or they are placed in a completely extravagant way. The spelling mistakes are legion, and I'm not talking about the word in Old French, but words he doesn't know how to spell, often technical terms or Greek and Latin roots. It's true that French is not his mother tongue, but it's clear that he didn't receive the education he claims to have had. So, as I said, Waldeck spent his life writing his own myth, even if it meant taking some liberties with the truth. I have realized that this diary is not what it seems. It's not a diary written day by day, as its presentation suggests. It has been rewritten. Here are some clues. March 7, 1832. I was told this much later. The sentence was not added later in the margin, but is in the middle of the text, and the spelling is the same, the ink identical. Then he is clearly confused about the dates of some events. October 22. On Monday in the ruins, I met a strange character. Here we are talking about Pedro Lopez, the so-called misanthrope of the ruins. January 4, 1833. I began a drawing of the interior of the eastern underground passage with my encounter with Pedro Lopez sitting like a ghost in the middle of the gallery. So far, so good, but April 11. Encounter with an Indian in the underground, Pedro Lopez. So he repeated the encounter twice on very different dates. And the same for his encounter with the Lacandan woman Nicte. April 4. Nicte killed an ocelot. But May 16, I found a wounded Lacandan woman in the forest, Nicte, among other clues. Let's move on to the expedition itself. I won't go into the epic tales of the journey, which claims that he met and discussed matters with Generals Calderon and Santa Anna, which is highly doubtful in the middle of a war. As I was saying, he quickly fell out with his employees. I quote, I believe that Schmitty's real reason for retiring is that he fears an attack on my person and doesn't want to be compromised. Or, the priest warned me that Schmitty had said that I was an impostor with false paper. Mr. Cournillon does nothing but sleep and swing in his hammock. Mr. Fodria is very stubborn and quarrelsome, very dizzy and carefree. Or Mr. Fodria becomes sullen and unpleasant and wants to know everything about everything, decide everything, and yet, deep down, he knows nothing, not even his geometry. He doesn't know the terms used in all the science. Well, Waldeck had to resort to the judicial authorities to get rid of these companions, but he says, I have to resign myself to suffering a lot. The authorities here are not able to protect me against two men who would like to attack me. Fodria was the last to leave, stealing some material on the way, and then Waldeck nicknamed him the Scarface, and found himself alone with his servants and the local workers he hired to work on the site. From the moment he set foot on the site, Waldeck came face to face with his new nemesis, Doña Irene, an elderly wealthy landowner from Palenque. They led a group of workers to dismantle the central panel of the Temple of the Cross. I quote, At dawn, we were warned that they intended to remove the stones from the center of the bas-reliefs depicting the supposed worship of the cross. We arrived at the site containing this curious relic, and indeed it had been removed from its place, face down. A certain Doña Irene, a wealthy elderly woman from the area, had it dismantled to send it to the United States. After appealing to the mayor, threatening to involve the vice president of Mexico, and then writing to the governor of Chiapas, we have copies of all those letters, he managed to prevent the looting, but he did not make many friends in the village. Well, the site had been regularly looted for years, I quote. These two reliefs were removed from their place by Deputy Bravo more than 30 years ago, and he had them embedded in the walls of his house in the village of Palenque. Or this bas-relief that serves as a door threshold, I quote, The stone is worn from much walking on it. It had been 18 years since it was placed here. Waldeck also clashes with Dr. Courroy, a friendly Frenchman who has known the place for a long time. But Waldeck cannot stand competition. He wants to be recognized as the only expert on the site. I quote, After practicing his profession as a surgeon in the state of Tabasco and serving as head of the military hospital there, Mr. Courroy got into his head, without the slightest prior study, to become an antiquarian, and for 18 years he has been writing about the ruins of Palenque. This good man does not see the point of measuring monuments with the most scrupulous accuracy and drawing reliefs, since this has already been done by others. According to him, the ruins are antediluvian, and he cannot provide any physical evidence of this or argue about the possibility of his idea. Apart from the fact that it does nothing to attract sympathy, living conditions in Palenque are precarious. The corn has been depleted after the floods and money is scarce. I quote, You can't get sugar in this damn town. And when you can, it costs 25 soles a pound, and the country is full of it. You lazy bones. Waldeck had left with only half of the money he had hoped to raise from the subscription. The company's treasurer, the Count of Chaptal, had to continue looking for patrons. But quickly he warned him that after Santa Anna's revolution, he could no longer count on any money coming in. In the end, it was Viscount Kingsborough who saved the expedition, subscribing 2,500 libras. Furthermore, life in a village and in an isolated place in the middle of the forest is not without its dangers. I quote, I escaped the sting of a large scorpion when I opened the tent. I killed it. Or, last night, I killed a vampire bat that kept coming back to my tent. Or, I have already lost 2 chickens to tiger cats, and this morning I killed one. You also have to take care of your health, especially when you're supposed to be 66 years old. I quote, The bruise on my leg has turned into an ugly ulcer. If I were in a village with my wife, she might think I have been indulging in vice. Since the 18th, I've been feeling so weak that it seems like gonorrhea. Well, in addition, a cholera morbus epidemic was brewing. It was this epidemic that prevented him from returning to Palenque after the summer of 1833 and made him decide to leave for Yucatan instead. It is clear that Waldeck was not a prison boss, but the unwillingness of his workers did not help either, and one wonders why. I quote, "We usually give the Indian mayor the money for the man's day in advance, but he has already gotten drunk twice with it, and we are short of workers." Or, "I wish all Mexicans would go to hell. Nothing can be done in this damned country, even with the best will in the world." Well, or, "Since the authorities have left the village, the Indians do as they please and even refuse to work, even though they are being paid a third more than usual." I wouldn't have liked to be his servant either. In a very strange way, it's clear that they weren't exactly zealous. I quote, "José was drunk all day yesterday and drank away a month's day wages for transporting chicken, which arrived in three trips." And in advance, I'm really sorry for the next quote. Waldeck's words. "These men must be treated like Negroes until they can be treated differently. Without that, nothing can be done. Cheating is the last of the evils they commit. I have much to fear from them, even though I only demand that they do their duty." Well, it must be said that at the time, slavery was still legal in France and other countries, but it doesn't excuse everything. Well, in such a context, our dear Waldeck has become a little paranoid. I quote, "The chiefs do everything in their power to attract the hatred of their fellow men. It is nothing more than murder, theft, and injustice. All Mexicans are as capable of meanness as one can be." Or, "Yesterday I received a very flattering letter from the governor of Chiapas, dated 26. I see that the mayor opened it. The seal was wet. It has been opened and clumsily resealed with wax of a different color, and the two torn layers are separated by wax. In addition, shortly after leaving Palenque, Santa Anna soldiers raided his cabin. Fortunately, he had taken his work from Palenque to Villahermosa for safekeeping. His drawings were eventually sized in Yucatan, but contrary to what Waldeck says, there were only 16 of them, of which he had hidden the drafts. We have the text of all the legal proceedings against him. Let us now turn to his work. It should be noted that, apart from all the unpleasant words, there is very, very little archaeological or ethnographic data in the diary he writes every day. We will come to the other diaries later. But about the carnival, he says, "The naked men paint their entire body with a red color they call achiote, made from the fruit of a plant. The only garment they wear is a mashtatl, a white pepper cap with a long macaw feather at the tip, an ancient rattle in one hand, and a stick with a kind of feather painted red and blue." Other, more interesting, sorry for the noise, other, more interesting are dressed on the back with the bashloon or ocelot skins, their legs, arms, and face painted with ochre hairs and irregular black circles painted all over, a paper cup also painted like the legs, etc., and a small reed whistle in the mouth with which they make a very high-pitched noise. In their right hand, they have a tiger's claw with which they scratch themselves. Their music consists of two huehuetl, each made from a single piece of skin stretched rather crudely with the animal intestines, a kind of oboe made from reed, and a reed fixed with wax. One of the musicians plays the beats with the whole turtle shell, that is, with the belly or sternum part that is not separated from the shell on the back. Between late March and early April 1833, he made a round trip to Tonina and sketched the visible buildings. He had planned to excavate the site after finishing at Palenque, but was unable to do so because of cholera. We have already published this part of the story with Peter Mathews and Callaway in Expedition magazine. Let us highlight only the mode of transportation. I quote, "A strong, rough chair with a plank for the footrest is carried with the individual seated in it on the back of an Indian who carries this weight on his back and head, just as the leperos in Mexico carry their bundle." One day, when the town's dignitaries had come to see him working in the ruins and were preparing to spend the night in the palace, a strange event occurred, a rain of stones. I quote, "My cook told me that since 11 o'clock a deluge of stones had fallen on the bed of the ladies and gentlemen, and that there was no doubt that the guardian of the ruins, the enchanter, wanted to punish Mrs. Irena for trying to remove the relief of the cross last year. I found them on their knees, rosary in hand, and the rain of stones continued everywhere, and I guessed that the guardian did not like the prayers. I did my best to reassure the woman, and ask the men to follow exactly what I thought was the best to do to capture the Indians responsible for this farce, and punish them on the spot so that they could be brought to justice. In these immense forests, there are still tribes of idolatrous and wandering lacandones. They probably pay no attention to a loner like me, but they feel jealous when they see 12 people and 20 pack animals coming to settle on the ruin of the site of their former superstition. And the rain of stones may not be from other sorcerers, but from these Indians who are very skilled with the sling. Well, the whole text is much longer, but here you have the main part. Among the people he described was Maria del Sol, a young albino woman. I quote, "Her hair was like gold instead of white, and her skin like the finest satin, which is what distinguishes her from European. The parish priest assured me that this unfortunate race is very common in Chiapas, and that both white and Indians abhor them." He also meets José Lopez, who he calls the misanthrope of the ruins, because he used to hide there. This man tells him all kinds of stories about Palenque's past, but, as we shall see, his knowledge goes far beyond the imaginable. And I believe that Waldeck invented this character to give credence to his own hypothesis. Well, as I have already said, Waldeck's data are accurate and deserve to be studied. One only has to look at the evolution of the drawings. Here. For example, the plans of the palace, which he had largely cleared of debris. Let's be clear, I have seen recent reports in which the cross-sections are of much poorer quality. Not to mention the fact that the buildings have suffered further damage since then, so this is the first record of their condition. As for the method, there is nothing to complain about, as the survey is carried out using a grid, as is still done today. So why are his drawings sometimes wrong? I quote, "I only sketch the drawing and put them in the state of being finished from memory, completing only the essential." And so, back in Europe, from copy to copy, the details are increasingly modified, but the first sketches are very accurate. I quote, all these characters are almost invisible because of the limestone agglomeration that cover them, and I used muriatic acid and nitric acid to clean it, but I don't have enough for more inscriptions." I quote, "I have been digging a hole to get into the base of the tower for 2 days, and today I gave up. I found them mixed with yellow earth, which crumbles constantly and puts the workers in danger of being buried under the rubble." However, as we shall see, he made some discoveries. Well, Waldeck is famous for his depictions of elephant heads, but for him it was logical. because he had seen fossilized mammoth bones in Mexico with his own eyes, and at that time no one knew how to date them. Like all scholars of his time, Waldeck subscribed to the theory of diffusionism. Among his numerous speculations on the origins of the Palenqueans, we may cite: the two figures in this relief seems to me to represent the Vishnu of the Brahms and Brahma, Neptune and Jupiter. If I could find a Shivan or a Pluto, I would have the Indian system at the basis of the ancient Trinity. Or, as you can see on the right of the screen, I had already observed in several places that the palace had been painted in 3 different periods in very remote time. But there, instead of ornaments or animals, I found letters, complete characters. The most modern layer, also very faded, seems to be Phoenician. It's the number 1 on your screen. The second layer is unquestionably Cludiform, number 2. And the third, which is the oldest, has characters that I dare not pronounce, but which seems to me to be Egyptian, which is a clear proof that he never was to the Egypt expedition of Napoleon, by the way. As I said, José López had told him details of the history of Palenque, but also about the procedures of circumcision as practiced by the Jews, and mummification in the Egyptian style, techniques that I don't think he could have known about. His strange hypothesis included confusing the ornate crest on the roofs with watchtowers. About giants, I quote, "All clergymen and people considered to be the most educated in the country always claimed that Palenque had been built and inhabited by a race of giants. The bones of enormous pachyderms discovered at the time of the conquest and presented by gullible men as human skeleton spread this error. The giants would have built corridors wide enough to allow them to move around comfortably. I'm not a giant and could barely squeeze my obese body onto the stairs of the tower." But in the end, also he found few artifacts during his excavation, which were nevertheless extensive. Waldeck did observe some interesting elements. Despite his fantasies, some of his observations anticipated later scholarship. For example, at the foot of the frieze of the captives of giants, he found a skull that was probably a ritual deposit of abandonment or termination. This is my previous postdoctoral topic, and this type of deposit with human remains is quite common. He reconstructed the profile of this individual in a drawing, comparing it to that of the bas-relief, thus anticipating modern forensic anthropology. In the construction field of the palace, he also discovered huge layers of shell, which are either a midden or a construction technique that has been attested at other sites. Finally, in the so-called Temple of Death, he mentions a pit that could be the echo of one of the ritual caches discovered by Del Rio 14 years before. In letters sent from Yucatan to Mr. Jomard, a member of the Institut de France, he wondered about the possibility of obtaining dates from the growing rings of mahogany, cedars, and pepper trees, or from the accretion rate of stalactites. Such insights show that beneath his eccentricities, Waldeck sometimes proved to be far ahead of the scientific method of his time. Waldeck's works thus oscillate between precision and distortion, between invaluable documentation and speculative invention. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Johann. And now to José Daniel Martínez Gastélum, Waldeck's attempts at Maya and Aztec decipherment of hieroglyphic writing. Take it away, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Jim. Good evening, everyone. It's very nice to have this opportunity. We are very grateful with Jim Reed and Michael Rogeri for the opportunity to share some of the insights and the research we have done for the past 2 years and a half regarding Jean-Frédéric Waldeck. And in my case, I'm going to talk a little bit about the early decipherment of Mexican and Maya writing. I apologize beforehand for my little puppies. Sometimes can be a little bit scared of the possums, so I apologize beforehand. And today I want to talk a little bit about the elephant in the room. Before 2013, I remember reading bits and pieces on Waldeck, as once was called the Baron Munchausen of Mesoamerican Studies. But I remember when I started my PhD program at La Trobe University in 2013, one morning, Dr. Peter Mathews arrived to campus, and he gathered all of us. Carl was there on that meeting, I recall. And he showed us some of his research on Waldeck. And it was the first time I saw a lot of previously unknown Waldeck drawings.
Hey,
I was totally amazed.
Daniel, can I ask you to speak closer to your speaker?
Okay.
We're not picking you up as loud as we did Carl.
Okay. Here is it here better?
No, go ahead.
Yep. Perfect. And I remember looking at these beautiful drawings, and one question came to my mind for many years, that how accurate were those drawings in comparison to the previous elephants that Carl discussed in depth before, and what can we learn from the early attempts of Waldeck to approach to Mexican Maya writing. Skipping 10 years later, in 2023, I received an email from Carl telling me that there was a lot of drawings to continue exploring. And I came to this a set of charts that it really caught my attention from Waldeck. As you can see here, we have 3 of the 6 charts I'm going to discuss tonight. And most of them, they focuses on the Mexica writing system, and one of them will focus on the Maya writing system. The first one that we see here under the 536, it's a depiction of the Tonalpoali, or the names of the 20th signs of the 260-day calendar of the Mexica. Later on, we are going to discuss a little bit about the Xiuhpohualli, or the cycle of 52 years. We start with, in this particular case, with Setochli, or one rabbit. And later there is a very interesting chart that Waldeck called a calendrier Mexican, or the Mexican calendar, which are very interesting in order to understand Waldeck's mind and his early studies, not only into the Mexica glyph system, but also into the language. Furthermore, we are going to talk tonight a little bit on the research that he did on toponyms, which is a very interesting one, and also the onomastics of the Mexica. One of the other things that I wanted to stress a little bit on my presentation is, where are the sources? Are we talking about imaginative sources, or did Waldeck actually look into sources to create these charts? And the results are really amazing. And finally, we're going to discuss a little bit on the study of Maya writing, which is a very interesting chart made by Waldeck, discussing the difference between the Landa manuscript and at the moment when I started looking into this one, an unknown codice, and this codex turned out to be the Paris Codex, and we will discuss all of these things tonight. So without further ado, let's start with the analysis. So let's start with the study of the Tonalpoali, which is divided into 2 sections, 8 columns, 10 lines, and we have 89 hieroglyphics on this chart. It's very the first thing that caught my attention when I was analyzing this chart is the first 2 columns in these 2 sections. Unlike the rest of the hieroglyphs that we can see at the moment, we can see that Waldeck used a little bit of shades and gave them a three-dimensionality to these particular depictions. And I was trying to figure out why it was that. Why is not this bidimensionality more common from the codices given to these particular depictions? And after a long search among Mexica stone monuments, I came to the conclusion that actually we are dealing with the sunstone or La Piedra del Sol. I was able to make an analysis of each one of the 20 signs of the Tonalpoali depicted at the Piedra del Sol and compare it with Waldeck's drawings in order to see his degree of accuracy, his wins, his mistakes, and what can we learn from this chart. And the results are very interesting. The entire, one of the first ones who gave me the key to identify the Piedra del Sol as the potential source of this first column in Waldeck's study, it was the sign Zipatli. I found it very interesting, this depiction of the Zipatli monster with the tail upwards. And I could recall in all my glyphic adventures that might be from the Piedra del Sol, but I was not sure until I started making my own drawings, trying to compare the elements with Waldeck's. And we have, after a careful analysis of the subject, I came to the conclusion that there are three categories where we can encompass Waldeck's drawings. First of all, we can see that some of the pictures of Waldeck, while the main characteristics and lines remain, for example, in the meticulously, we can see that Waldeck was able to keep some of the lines of the skull shape. However, he used a little bit of westernized style to conclude the drawing. But nevertheless, you can still see some of the original lines into the drawing. In a second category, Waldeck, rather than through invention or his imagination, most likely because he was not very familiar with inscriptions. It happens because I have seen sometimes things on the stone that were not there. He was trying to give a better, to the best of his knowledge, an approach to the hieroglyphs. Nevertheless, as you can see here in the De Malinali, you can see that he gave a bird beak and a face and wings to the skull-like Malinali sign. And on a third category, we see something that is very interesting from Waldeck. He was able to record some of the elements that are no longer seen in the monument due to the erosion. And I would say maybe sometimes due to the mistreatment that the monument suffered during the 19th century. There are accounts that some people use it to play darts or even throwing a rotten fruit or other things to the stone, contributing to its deterioration. And one of the things that caught my attention, because I was thinking, well, where did Waldeck study this monument? In the early 1830s, early 20s, before he head to Palenque, Waldeck, most likely location to study this monument firsthand was on the south tower of the Metropolitan Cathedral in Mexico City nowadays. As we can see in this William H. Jackson beautiful picture, you can see the Piedra del Sol on the left side of the tower. So very likely Waldeck was able to to study this monument and to draw these glyphs directly from the monument at the cathedral. Another thing that it really caught my attention is that he used a lot of instances from the codices, and I wanted to know where did Waldeck got his sources. And the first one that I was able to identify is the Codex Vaticanus 3773, at the present day in Rome. And one of the things I was able to identify is a number of 28 instances where Waldeck drew hieroglyphs from the tonal poali in a very accurate manner, and in a lot of cases I was able to determine from which page of the codex the instance came. Let's see some examples that I was able to check. Another thing that is very important to understand is I was trying to think, well, where did Waldeck got his sources? When I started this research, I thought at the beginning that probably he used the Kingsborough 1831 edition of Antiquities of Mexico and the depiction of the Codex Vaticanus 3773. However, as we can see here, if we compare the original codex with Kingsborough edition, we can see there are major differences. And Waldeck's drawings, actually we have here two drawings. One of them is located at the National Library in Paris, France. Goes by the number N231915, where we can see the Zipacli is more akin to the one from the original codex than Kingsborough's Agostino de Aglio's drawing from 1831. And in these three instances, for example, we have the same pattern. When we deal with art, there is some sort of like a shell decoration at the center of the hieroglyph, which Aglio misses, but Waldeck includes his own version, which is relatively similar as the one we find in the codex at the moment. And also we see it with the cat. The cat depicted by Kingsborough is totally different from Waldeck's versions and the original codex versions, which started making me wonder, did Waldeck went to Rome to study the codex itself sometime between 1840s to 1875, just before he passed away? And on a second instance, we have a similar case. In the case of the Codex Borgia, we have 19 instances where Waldeck drew examples from the Codex. And a lot of instances, we can identify where in the Codex he drew it, or at least to provide good candidates for the drawings of that Waldeck provided. Let's see as well some examples. For example, with Zipacli, Ehecat, and Cali, we find the same pattern that with the Codex Vaticanus 3773, where Waldeck is not following Aglio's drawings published in Antiquities of Mexico, but rather he's using, he's looking at the codex in order to create these beautiful drawings. They are not exempt for a little bit of missing details, but by large and far, they are very similar to the ones depicted in the codex. Another codex that also I suspect Waldeck himself went to Vienna to inspect is the Codex Vindobonensis, which at the moment is at the National Library of Austria, where he was able to draw 7 examples. And one of the things that I found just before I finished this presentation is that Waldeck actually has a depiction of the Vindobonensis, page number 3, among his archives. And a lot of the drawings can be very gives us without a doubt the source of the drawings we see in this chart. And as I mentioned before, if we compare Aglio's drawings with the codex itself and Waldeck's, we can draw the conclusions that Waldeck copied from the codex rather than from Aglio's drawings. Another source that Waldeck employed here is the Codex Boturini. And in one of his documents, in his this large archive found at the Newberry Library, Waldeck tells us a little bit that he was able to study a codex at the University of Mexico. And after a careful reading of the potential clues that what was this codex that he mentions, I came to the conclusion that it's the Boturini Codex. In this case, he only drew 4 of the examples. In the cases of Cali, house, touchlight, rabbit, a cat, reed, and Tepac, flint. And in another instance, he also got 1 example from La Tira de Tepechpan, which is the year Ome Touchli, or 2 rabbits, which is also found in the codex, as we see here in page number 17, Vuelta. Also, Waldeck was able to include some other more modernized drawings, and it's very interesting because here we will see that he has a little bit of honesty when he talks about these particular modernized depictions of Tonalpoali signs. He says that they are modern versions, but he based in some other sources, as we will see when we get into the Mexican calendar chart. And now we have a very interesting puzzle from this chart. If we look at the Tepac chart, we see that the second sign has a very interesting iconography, particularly these 2 volute scrolls-like elements at the size of the flint, which I tried to locate it with all the codices that I came across in my research for over 2 months, and I could not come with an answer until I came to the Tudela Codex, which, as you can see here, has some of the similar depictions as the example given by Waldeck. But as we know, the Tudela Codex was in the possession of the Minguez family from La Coruña in Spain. Until 1947, it was made known to the world. And my question here is, did Waldeck have earlier access to the Tudela Codex? What was here, what was in Mexico or in Europe? Another possibility is that Waldeck, could he have access to an unknown codex from the same family, from the Maclavecchiano family, that is at the moment lost in time? Only further research will give us more insights into this very interesting puzzle given by Waldeck himself. Okay, now moving to the study of the Xiuhpohualli. Here we have a very interesting chart made of 4 columns with 13 lines, which starts with the date Setochli, of 1 rabbit, and finishes on the year 13 Cali. And here I was able to determine that Waldeck used 2 main sources in order to create this chart. The first one of them is the Boturini Codex, And the second is the account given by Antonio de León y Gama in 1790, called Descripción Histórica y Cronológica de las Dos Piedras, which is the first formal study of the sunstone that we were discussing before. One of the first things that caught my attention is why starting this chart on one rabbit. And as I was going through Waldeck's large documentation, I came about a script called Calendrier Toltec, which is at the Newberry Library, where he provides not only one of the accounts of the Boturini Codex and how he came to look at it at the university in Mexico, but also gives us a lot of his insights on the names of the Veintenas or the Cempapowali of the Mexica. And one of the things that also was able to locate is that if we talk about the León y Gama's document, he mentions that among the Mexica, the reckoning of time started on this year, Setochli, and also this one is found on the Mendoza Codex, which is now on the Bodleian Library in England, in Oxford University. And one of the things I was able to look is that Waldeck here is trying to give us a chart that can allow us visually to understand the cycle of 52 years of the ancient Mexica. But not only that, he also was able to use the drawings from the Boturini Codex in order to provide the glyphic information for this chart. So he's using two different sources in order to create a chart. And as you can see here, it's very, you can see the iconography is very similar to the ones found in the Boturini Codex. Now moving to the Calendar Mexican, this particular chart is very interesting and I think should be also used in modern day time in order to provide a more simplified or even didactic explanations of the Mexican calendar or even the Maya. It can be applied to the Mayan hieroglyphs. Here, Waldeck was able to provide us with a list of the signs, but as I mentioned before, at the top of the chart, he has a little note where he explains that those are modernized versions. He's not trying to give us their accurate, their inventions. He's mentioning that it's just modernized versions of these glyphs. However, he was able to use a lot of sources, claiming that Diego Valadez and his important work, Retórica Cristiana, published in 1579, was the main source of these charts. And here we can see the 20 signs of the Tonalpoali with their Nahuatl names, a translation of them, but also we can see the names of the 18 Veintenas, or part of the Cempapowali of the Mexica, with their names, the gods associated with them, an interpretation given by Waldeck in French, and also the occupation of the said deities. And even in one instance, he was able to provide a little bit of his studies on the rituals dedicated to these Veintenas of the ancient Mexica. Here we have some of the sources that Waldeck probably had access to. As I mentioned before, Diego Valadez, 1579, Retórica Cristiana was the main source that Waldeck claims in order to make the chart. And actually you can see the tonal poali signs at the very center of the wheel. But also I suspect that Waldeck was able to obtain access to some other calendric information, particularly when it comes to the Sempoala Poali or the Veintenas. In this case, is the account of Francesco Gemelli Carreri from 1700 called Giro del Mundo. And as we can see here, the Sempoala Poali signs are more similar to the ones that we see on the Calendrier Mexican. Another possible sources that Waldeck was able to check during his lifetime most likely was the Lorenzana, where once again we see the Sempoala Poali characters, and in some cases very similar to the ones depicted by Waldeck, as well as the Francisco Javier Clavijero's work, Ancient History of Mexico, where we also can see the tonal poali and the Sempoala Poali. And also it wouldn't be strangely that Waldeck even was able to see the originals, as we can see in these calendrical wheels published by Beitia in 1907. Okay, now going to the toponyms, one of the things I was very curious about is where was Waldeck's sources here. And the main source that Waldeck used for this study is Historia de la Nueva España, made by Francisco Antonio Lorenzana in 1780. Sorry, 1770. And here, this is the first published edition that we know of the Matrícula de Tributos, one of the main sources alongside the Mendoza Codex to understand the economics of ancient Mexico, Tenochtitlan, and also the toponyms around the Mexica world. And in all cases, but one, which was taken from the Boturini Codex, which one is Tecpayocan. All the rest of the glyphs employed here by Waldeck came from this 77 edition of the Francisco Antonio Lorenzana. Another source that probably was the origin of the idea of the chart probably came from Francisco Javier Clavijero and his Ancient History of Mexico. As we can see in this chart, Clavijero was able to put some of the toponyms. As you can see, there is a lot of Westernized influence in these drawings, which also Waldeck followed in his chart. And I think this particular Clavijero chart gave the idea to Waldeck to create the chart itself. Now, when it comes to onomastics, it's very interesting that here Waldeck is using 3 different sources in order to create this chart. And the first and main inspiration, once again, is Francisco Javier Clavijero and his Ancient History of Mexico. Here we can see a chart that Clavijero made, where you have the names of 9 Mexica rulers, going from Acamapitzin all the way to Motecuzoma Xocoyotzin. And here we can see all of them in Waldeck's chart. And one interesting thing that we see is that he is following closely Clavijero's iconography. However, when it comes to the faces, he's trying to give a more iconography. He changed it a little bit to conform more to the Boturini Codex standards. Nevertheless, you can see there is some tridimensionality in his shading while he was doing these drawings. And in this case, we can see most of the drawings here comes from the Clavijero chart. On a second, and also we can see that Clavijero probably was able to consult the Mendoza Codex, as we can see here. I just give you two examples. The first is the name for the Aztec ruler, Atamapichli, where we can see the Clavijero's example, Waldeck's example, the Kingsborough 1831 example of the Mendoza Codex, and my rendering of the Mendoza Codex. Also, we can see a similar pattern when we talk about this quad. We can see Clavijero's example, Waldeck, following very closely Clavijero, but when it comes to Kingsborough and the Mendoza Codex, we see a total different iconography. And finally, Waldeck was able to take two names from the Boturini Codex, particularly on the passage of the capture of Huehuehuitzilihuitl and the king Cosh of Culhuacan. He had both names taken from the Boturini Codex, and it's very interesting that Waldeck was able to keep, in most instances, the proportions and some of the iconography present in the codex nowadays. And as well on the example coming from the hieroglyphic for Kosh, the king of Culhuacan. But that's not enough. Also, Waldeck wanted to provide inspiration of how did the King Kosh would it look like carrying a scepter with his hieroglyphic name on top, as we can see here. Okay, now the third source that Waldeck was derived his study was the Historia de la Nueva España that we discussed before from Lorenzana. And he grabbed 3 instances of hieroglyphics from the Matrícula de Tributos. And in this particular case, we can see he used Lorenzana's as the main source. He was not able to consult the original work while making this one. As you can see in these 3 instances, the hieroglyphic resembles more the Lorenzana edition rather than or at least my interpretation of the codex at the present time, because unfortunately the names are a little bit errored, for example, in the case of Mokiwitz. And now we get to the study of the Maya calendar. This is a very interesting chart made by Waldeck probably sometime after 1864, after the publication of the Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán by Brassou de Bourbeau in his French edition. And the first thing that I have in mind when I started looking into this chart is compared if Waldeck was able to check the original Landa manuscript, or he was just only following Brassou de Bourbeau's edition. And I went through, to a detailed analysis of all the hieroglyphics, and I compared it with the only 2 codices that due to their iconography and paleography, I was able to use as point of comparison. The first one is the Dresden Codex and also the Paris Codex. And I came to a very interesting and unexpected conclusion, as we can see here, in some of the examples derived from the Paris Codex. For example, one of the things I noticed, if we go to the Kimi cliff, is the relación of Landa's relation doesn't have this protruding element coming out from the Kimi face. But Waldeck was able to catch up this element, and he was able to provide a glyphic interpretation from this one, which comes from the page 10b of the Paris Codex. Or at least that's my proposal. Where is this embodied eye that often accompanies the dead god? Waldeck was able to see from Brassur's mistake, and he was able to identify a similar pattern coming from the Paris Codex. If we go to the very bottom of this first part of the chart, when we see the Lamat day, we can see that neither the Relación or Brassur's publication look like a Waldeck's drawing. And the most likely conclusion is that he drew it from the Paris Codex. Sorry. And we see this a similar pattern when we analyze the Muluk and the Venn signs of Waldeck's chart. The signs are very similar to the ones on the Paris Codex, while Ok, Chuen, and F are more, well, in the particular case of Chuen and F are more similar to the ones from Brasseur de Bourbourg's publication, and Ok is not correct. It's actually a key that was included in the wrong spot. We see a similar pattern when we go for Ik, Ish, Men, Kiv, Kaban, or Snap. We can see all these examples came from the Paris Codex, and Men came from the Relation of 1864 from Brasseur de Bourbourg. In the cases of Kawak, Ahau, and Ik, we can see that they come from the Paris Codex, while Imish and Akbal came from the Paris Codex. Imish and Akbal came from Brasseur de Bourbourg's Relation. And besides that, Waldeck was able to provide us with some more examples coming from the Paris Codex. And unfortunately, while they did not provide any fruitful reading, I think it's important to understand that Waldeck was able to visualize and to identify some patterns, in despite that they are not the right readings. The first case we see it is in the Shul month. We can see the Ni. At the end, he was able to compare it with this Ahau Ni syllable at the end of this cartouche. Same with the word Ikim or owl. Waldeck was able to see a similar pattern between the E and the Ki found on the Landa's manuscript and also on the Paris Codex, although they are not related semantically. In other cases, one of the things we need to praise Waldeck for is for the great drawings that he made of the Paris Codex. They're really beautiful to look at, and as you can see, most of the iconography and the details of the hieroglyphs are in place. And this is very new. This is 2 weeks ago, up to now, that I was able to locate further evidence that Waldeck knew about the Paris Codex. One of them comes from the chart itself. Unfortunately, the pencil is very thin and very hard to see, but it says something in the lines of Codex Route 19 BY, which stands from the Imperial Library of France, which was the former name of the National Bibliothèque of France nowadays, and from another manuscript called Du Calendrier du Catec, which is at the Newberry Library. And here we have one excerpt from Waldeck telling us about this Ikim sign that we were discussing earlier. It says that this Ikim sign resembles a lot to a signature sign on a codex that I no longer possess. That's a very interesting statement from Waldeck. A codex that he no longer possesses. Furthermore, we see another script called Met au papier d'agave, or Met the paper of agave. And here we have another excerpt, the true Palenque manuscript that the late Jacques-Joseph Champollion Figat from the Imperial Library showed me under a double crystal like a Mexican codex. It was in reasonable good state. It is 30 centimeters wide and more than 2 meters long, covered on both sides with catun regularly disposed like a chessboard, each catun measuring near 3 square centimeters. Here we have a very interesting account. Waldeck says that Jacques-Joseph Champollion, yes, the brother of Jean-François Champollion, showed him a codex that was under a glass, and Waldeck identifies this codex as Palenque. He compares to his previous work done at Palenque, and he concludes that these monuments from Palenque and this script are from the same civilization. And in another manuscript, there is an analysis of the chart that I just find out 4 days ago. Once again, Waldeck calls the codex. He called it the Codex D number 2 from the BY, from the Imperial Library. And in this particular case, when it comes the Codex D, the document tells us the D stands from Duruy, who was at the time the Minister of Education and Teaching of the government of France, who in 1864 he published one of the first images of the Paris Codex. And here Waldeck gives us a very careful analysis of all the hieroglyphics I showed you previously, and that he got it from this codex, that in this particular case calls the Duruy Codex. And one of the things that I would like to place before I finish my talk is the possibility of how involved was Waldeck in the story of the Paris Codex. We know that in 1832 we have the earliest record of the purchase by the Imperial Library of the Codex, and around 1848, 1849 we have the first drawings made by Agostinho di Aglio, the same one who was aiding Lord Kingsborough with the Antiquities of Mexico. And in a copy that is at the Newberry Library, unfortunately, is not online at the moment. Aglio included some of the pages on the 9th volume of the Paris Codex that probably was meant to be the volume number 10. And from there we go to 1859, where Leon de Rosny discovers the manuscript at the National Library. And in 1864 is published the first edition by S.E.M. Duruy. One of the things that I would like to continue researching on this topic was Waldeck involved in the acquisition of the said codex? One thing that we know from the latest research I've been doing on Waldeck's manuscripts is that he was in Mérida, where I am at the moment, and he got permission from the bishop or the archbishop of the diocese of Yucatan to go around the convents trying to look for codices. And one of the things that is very interesting, he claims that José Martínez Espinosa de los Monteros, who was the only astronomer located in Mérida at the moment, showed him a fragment of a codex. Unfortunately, Waldeck doesn't tell us much about this codex or provides a drawing that accompanies this codex that he saw in Mérida. But considering that Waldeck's knowledge of the codex around the time of the 1864, it wouldn't be surprising that he knew or had news earlier of the Paris Codex, if it was not him that took the Codex to France. But the last one is a hypothesis that needs to be proved before to be established. And this is one of the conclusions I get from this research project is that, in the words of paraphrasing Arthur Machen, our madman is becoming a sage, because we can see here a lot of scholarship is put into place by Waldeck by going to the locations, in the particular case of Rome or Vienna, to look at the codices, to make accurate drawings of the hieroglyphs, letting us know when the hieroglyphs are modernized versions, and also preparing charts that I think should be emulated until this day by educators or us that we are studying the Maya hieroglyphics in order to prepare presentations, or even create workshops or other educative resources. And thank you so much, and I really appreciate your time.
Great, thank you, Daniel. That was a really nice PowerPoint. Thanks for putting that all together.
Thank you.
Let's see, do we have Carl back yet? Yes, we do. But Danielle, first I want to say that the dogs barking, they obviously love you and wonder why you left them outside.
Yes.
I'd love to let you see them, let them in and see them jumping all over you and licking.
Exactly.
Not yet, not yet.
Not yet.
All right. Quit sharing your screen, Daniel.
Okay, I will stop sharing my screen.
Danielle, I had a quick question. From what you showed there, I mean, Waldeck is looking at the Paris Codex before anything is published, correct? I mean, he's looking directly at the source document, right? Because from what you can tell from the glyphs that he's copying over, he's looking directly at the source material itself, correct?
Correct. That's correct. He was able to draw make his drawings directly from the Paris Codex.
Yeah. So before anything was published.
Before anything, he's the first one who ever did a study that we know of the Paris
Yeah. So
Codex.
that's also to be commended there.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I see that he's using also, I mentioned this in our article, that he's using the same sort of style and charting that Champollion used. And he can see that if you can get enough of the variations, then you can draw a sort of general glyph to represent, a standard sort of, like we do the same thing, a standard glyph or a standard king glyph or something like that. And then you look at all the variations, you take the parallel elements and then you assemble them into a more generic glyph to represent the totality of variations. So that's really cool as well, right? And it's just a shame that these charts were not shared to a larger scholarly group, because if they were, they could have altered the path of early epigraphy and decipherment. Because again, that's exactly what we do. We chart the glyphs, we chart all their variations, and then that help us to understand the essential elements of each glyph. And then, of course, he's making some wild correlations between glyphs that aren't related. But the place to start, he knew the day names of the Maya days and the Maya months, and he's looking. He's searching for those commonalities and those parallels to see if he can attribute the Maya name with the glyph given in the monumental inscription. That's exactly the way you should proceed, you know. And here he just was never recognized. So yeah, just absolutely fascinating. And thank you for that incredibly astute and careful analysis and comparison.
Thanks for watching this Aztlander presentation. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And tune in to part 2. To subscribe to free monthly issues of the Aztlander Magazine of the Americas, contact your host, Jim Reed, at jimreedmaya@gmail.com. Thanks again.